Good evening and welcome to Chicago Tonight. I'm Paris Schutz.
And I'm Brandis Friedman. On the show tonight, Chicago police officers sometimes have to work 11 days straight. That and other highlights from a new watchdog report.
Chicago will have fewer voter precincts in the next election. What that means for those heading to the polls.
Leases for discount mall vendors have been extended. An update on some of the owners' plans for the Little Village Shopping Center.
A look at racial segregation in churches, part of WTTW's First-Hand Segregation series.
A year after thousands of Afghan refugees settled in the U.S., Muslim-led nonprofits work together to address growing needs in the community.
He always said that his photographs and fragments were no substitute for the building itself.
And we introduce you to the preservationist behind the lens, Richard Nickel, in a new exhibit at the Driehaus Museum. But first, some of today's top stories. The Chicago Police Department has formed a caravan task force to crack down on drag racing. CPD says 9 people were arrested and 7 vehicles were seized over the weekend. But Superintendent David Brown says police will use social media and other tools to hold more people accountable.
We didn't arrest you or tow your car when the incident happened. There's video of you. There's video of your car and your behavior. And we won't rest until we bring everyone involved with harming our officers, damaging property, city property, our squad cars, to justice. And we'll prosecute them to the fullest extent of the law.
And a new city ordinance allows the CPD to impound vehicles used in illegal drifting or drag racing. And civilian oversight of the Chicago Police Department is taking shape after a bit of a delay. Mayor Lori Lightfoot announced the first 7 people to serve on Chicago's new Community Commission for Public Safety and Accountability.
The most important steps that we can take in bringing peace, lasting peace and safety to our communities is by getting the community involved and engaged and feeling like they've got a stake, that their voices are no longer going to be ignored, that they have a role in shaping what community safety looks like.
Lightfoot chose 7 individuals from 14 who had applied and been vetted by the City Council. Commissioners are charged with establishing annual goals for the police department, reviewing the CPD's budget, and helping to fill vacancies on the police board. They could also move to remove the CPD superintendent. Big responsibilities, but only temporary ones. Candidates tomorrow can begin to circulate petitions to run for district-level CPD oversight positions, and the winners of the February elections will choose a permanent community commission. You can read the names of the just-appointed commissioners and learn more about the timeline on our website. Chicago's election board faces a lawsuit over its plan to slice the number of precincts in future elections. Businessman Willie Wilson, who is running for mayor, says he believes it's a form of voter suppression.
Voters out of the whole state or perhaps around the whole country, our senior citizens, mind you now, they live off a fixed income. For them to move the poll, let's say a mile away or 5 or 6 blocks, is being unfair to our #1 voters.
The election board says it's reducing precincts in accordance with a new state law and that the overall number of polling locations in Chicago will not be greatly affected for the next 3 elections. We have much more on this coming up in just a bit. But up next, one-on-one with Chicago's watchdog to talk about findings from a new report on police fatigue. So please stay with us.
Chicago Tonight is made possible in part by Alexandra and John Nichols, the Jim and Kay Mabey family, the Polk Brothers Foundation, and the support of these donors.
Hundreds of Chicago police officers may have had to work 11 or more consecutive days last spring, according to a new report from the city's Inspector General. What's more, the IG's office says the police department's record keeping made it hard to even tell if the officers actually worked the scheduled days. Here to share the findings from this just released report is the Inspector General for the City of Chicago, Deborah Witzberg. Welcome back, and thank you for joining us, Deborah.
Thanks for having me.
So first, please walk us through the main findings of your report.
Sure. We looked at CPD's scheduling information for patrol officers on its first, second, and third watches during the months of April and May. We looked at cohorts of officers assigned to each of those watches in what are called day-off groups. Those are groups of officers which the department uses to calendar regular time off over the course of the year. And we found that by watch and day-off group, something like 1,100 CPD members, just again, patrol members on those first, second, and third watches, something like 10% of CPD's sworn members were scheduled to work 11 or more consecutive days during the months of April and May. So leading into, but not even quite in the middle of, kind of the busiest summer months. So from there, we then looked at a handful of specific individual members to verify what we were seeing and to determine what we could learn from CPD's records about whether the officers scheduled to work those days were in fact present for work for all of those consecutive days. And we found that some were and some weren't. That some members scheduled to work 11 or more consecutive days were in fact present all of those days, and that in other situations, that scheduling data did not accurately capture actual presence for all of those days.
And I want to come back to some of the challenges that your office experienced with that data, but the time period that you looked at was from April 1st, 2022 to May 31st. Of 2022, and in his response, Chicago Police Department Superintendent David Brown says that your report didn't really consider what was happening during that time period. He points to Memorial Day, of course, and the city being open for the first time since COVID. But why did you examine that particular time period?
Superintendent Brown, we provided a draft of this report before it was published to CPD to sort of make sure we were getting it right in the interest of accuracy and as a courtesy, and invited their response. Superintendent Brown's response is attached to our report. And in that response, I think he appropriately points out that in making scheduling decisions, the department needs to balance the interests of protecting public safety and the well-being and the rest of its members. That is the decision that is before the department. And the hope with our analysis is that we better equip those making that decision with information that is as good and as clear as possible, given the state of the record keeping. The fact of the matter is that, there are lots of potential solutions, I think, under consideration. We can't wait any longer to make decisions about managing and staffing the department to keep Chicagoans safe in uniform and out.
So let's talk about that record keeping, because the report was also critical of it. What were some of the problems your office experienced?
The problem is that the information one needs to look at to determine who is scheduled to work when and who is actually present and for how long, that information is stored across a number of different systems, and some of those systems require manual review. So information about the very small number of CPD members who are actually clocking in and out is in one system. What are called the attendance and assignment sheets are in another system. Those are sort of manually kept. They often indicate that a member is not present when they are in fact present and working overtime. And then the overtime information is kept in still another system. And so with the siloing of those records and that information, it's very hard to conduct this analysis in a thorough and kind of comprehensive way. That's problematic for us as an oversight matter. It's problematic for the department as a management concern.
What are we to take away then? Because it sounds like you found that in some instances those officers did work 11 or more days as scheduled. In some instances they did not. Is it possible that the CPD scheduling issues were worse than you were able to document, or maybe not?
Yes, absolutely possible. And we conducted this analysis really to arrive at as conservative as possible an estimate, explicitly to avoid overstating the problem. So yeah, I would expect that the group of officers scheduled to work 11 or more consecutive days was in fact higher than our estimate. That would be my best guess.
Does your office make recommendations on potential solutions?
We don't make recommendations in this report. The goal of this analysis really was, as I said, to sort of better equip the decision makers here with good information. We don't take a position on how many days in a row is too many without rest in this report. It is certainly the case that other industries have limitations on how long people can work without rest. Truck drivers and medical residents and airline pilots and so on. And so, I think there are important questions to ask here. We were not able to arrive at an exact number of CPD members who worked 11 days in a row. There's a question to be asked about whether any number is too many.
Separately, we know that Mayor Lightfoot today appointed a 7-member police oversight commission today. These are interim commissioners, and it's seen as the first step towards civilian oversight of the Chicago Police Department. What's your reaction to this, the power this commission will have, and who's been picked thus far?
You know, there's a really critical role in policing oversight and public safety policy for lived experience and community experience, and I'm hopeful that this is, exactly as you say, sort of a step in that direction for Chicago.
Do you think that this commission might be able to restore some of the damaged trust between some communities and the police department?
That is certainly the endeavor in which all of us should be engaged.
Okay, we'll have to leave it there. Inspector General Deborah Witzberg, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Police officers regularly face stress and trauma in a job that can put them in life or death situations. And as Chicago's Inspector General just told us, officers are sometimes scheduled to work 11 or more consecutive days. How does that kind of schedule impact their job performance and mental health? And how does it impact the communities they serve? Joining us now are Sandy Jo MacArthur, a retired assistant chief for the Los Angeles Police Department and a consultant to the University of Chicago Crime Lab. She is a specialist on officer mental health and well-being nationally. And Alderman Matthew O'Shea, who represents the 19th Ward on Chicago's southwest side. Thanks to you both for joining us. Alderman O'Shea, let's start with you, please. What's your reaction to the findings from in the Inspector General's report today?
I mean, I think those findings are exactly what those of us who have engaged in this topic thought. What's interesting is that is just the data from the months of April and May, where we weren't seeing police officers working 10, 20, 25 days in a row. You know, the start of this is really near Memorial Day. What would be interesting is to see the data from June, July, and August, when it was a recurring theme of days off being canceled on a regular basis. I think that would be more alarming and cause more concern.
Sandy Jo MacArthur, you've worked with a lot of officers in different parts of the country. How common is it for police officers in other major cities to have to work 11 or more days straight?
Well, generally, for deployment purposes, that's very uncommon. It is not considered a best practice by any stretch of the imagination. There are times in policing when there are emergencies, whether it's natural disasters or civil unrest or things that we saw over the last couple of years that cause us to have to cancel some days off. But to do it routinely and to do it where people are working more than 12 days in a row is actually very dangerous. It creates a situation of burnout, and there's a whole lot of fallout as a result of that as well. But it is very dangerous in jobs such as policing to be put in a situation where you're working more than 5, maybe 6 days in a row. And if you're doing it on a continuous basis, I agree with Alderman O'Shea that looking at police departments over the last year and a half would probably be even more alarming.
Sandy Jo, you mentioned burnout among officers. Let's talk about that a little bit more and how that burnout impacts the jobs that our officers do.
So burnout in general, there's a lot of research about burnout. In fact, the World Health Organization recognizes burnout as an actual disorder. So it's no longer anything that any job in our country, any career in our country should ignore. But it puts our officers in a really horrible situation because burnout, what they do know from all the research is that it's associated with symptoms of apathy, fatigue, cynicism, all the things we know are not good in policing. But it also creates situations where officers can develop sleep disorders. They become very irritable. They have poor performance, oftentimes poor performance. But my concern is always what happens to them when they're in those high-risk situations. We know it's very similar to what we see with truck drivers, with airline pilots. There are rules for how long they can fly before they have days off, and those rules are in place for a reason, for the safety of everybody on that plane, right? For example, officers are out there every single day and are faced with very, very difficult situations, life-threatening situations, in some situations, a lot of trauma. And this really can not just negatively impact them mentally, so their mental health is impacted, but we also know that there are general health disorders that result from burnout.
Alderman, you're proposing that police officers be guaranteed 24 hours off duty for every 60 hours that they work. Tell us about this ordinance, please.
Brandis, to break it down, it's the simplest way to do this, in that for every week that an officer works, that they be afforded 24 hours a day, 24 hours of rest. As Sandy Joe pointed out, federal government already does that with air traffic controllers, airline pilots, open road truckers. And what we've seen our officers here in Chicago, particularly the last few months, it's just dangerous. Police officers, each and every shift, have to make split-second decisions, life or death decisions. And when they do not have enough rest, when they do not have enough time to decompress, we're going to see a lot more problems arise. What is already the most dangerous job in America right now to be in law enforcement. Overworked, exhausted police officers are a danger to themselves. They're a danger to those that they are sworn to serve and protect.
And Alderman, 24 hours after basically working what sounds like a week, a little bit more than a week, sounds like it's something, but is that enough?
It's a start. It's something that we haven't done, something that has been widely discussed for certainly several months. I reached out to Inspector General Witzberg several weeks ago to ask if she would take a look at this problem, because this is a very serious public safety crisis. But Brandis, it points to an even bigger problem we have. 3 years ago, in August of 2019, we had more than 13,300 Chicago police officers. Today, just 36 months later, we're under 11,500, which is why we continue to see police officers' days off canceled, which is why we still see police officers working 12-hour shifts on a regular occurrence, time away from their families, time without rest. This is not sustainable. We have to do something. We have to do more.
And Sandy Jo, there have been shifting attitudes about police, at least since the civil unrest of 2020. Since that time, are officers facing a culture where, seeking mental health is stigmatized for them still?
Yes. It's very interesting because officers know oftentimes when they need help, and there's a lot that policy can actually do to help destigmatize going and seeking help. So, for example, right now in most agencies throughout the nation, if an officer is involved in, let's say, an officer-involved shooting, they're required to go see a psychologist, either a department psychologist or one that is contracted by their department. Officers have told me over and over again, and I had done my research on this just recently, that there should be more policies that require officers, that are triggers for officers to go to get the help, because that would destigmatize it altogether. The other thing that is a problem with stigma is oftentimes leaders within an organization don't really openly support it. And that makes a huge difference whether or not an officer feels comfortable going or not. If their supervisor, for example, is going, yeah, you got to go see the shrink, let me know if you're okay, with an attitude, that sets that stigma right there.
So a matter of leadership sort of setting the tone for that as well.
Absolutely.
We'll have to leave it there, but my thanks to 19th Ward Alderman Matthew O'Shea and Sandy Jo MacArthur for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Brandis.
And now to Paris for a look at new changes this election season. Paris.
Brandis, come November, Chicagoans will have far fewer places to vote than they did in June's primary election. That's because Chicago election officials have shrunk the number of voting precincts. It's a nearly 40% decrease that will put twice as many voters, perhaps, into each precinct. And joining us now with more are Max Bever, Director of Public Information with the Chicago Board of Elections, and Ami Gandhi, Senior Counsel with the Chicago Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights. Welcome both of you to Chicago tonight. And let's take a look at a graphic showing that the city's going to go from 2,069 voter precincts to 1,290. So that's a reduction of over 700 precincts. Max, what's driving this change?
Thank you, Paris. So I think it's important to note at the top that while precincts are being reduced, it is not the number of polling places that are being immediately reduced. We had 1,043 polling places serving 269 precincts just this last primary on June 28th. So that meant that most polling places were pulling double, even triple duty with the amount of precincts that were being served. Now that precincts are being reduced to 1,290, it's much more likely that every polling place will serve a single
basically
precinct.
you won't see 2 or 3 precincts in the same polling place, like say a school or a library, as you have in the past, correct?
That's right. So you won't see election judges pointing you to a different table in the same gymnasium serving the same precinct.
Ami Gandhi, what impact do you think this is going to have on voters in Chicago that in June perhaps voted in a different place that they're going to be voting in November?
Anytime that there are changes to polling places that people are instructed to go to, that causes a disruption. Anytime voters have questions about where to go in order to access their right to vote, there's a chance that something could fall through the cracks and they could be disenfranchised. We're not suggesting that voters get alarmed at this point in time. It's really important for there to be very clear and specific communication so that voters know their options, particularly Black and Brown communities who have faced disenfranchisement on a number of levels, to be given specific information about where to go to get the information they need to know in order to look up their polling place. We're one of those sources of information. Anyone can call the Nonpartisan Election Protection Hotline at 866-OUR-VOTE.
All right, and Max, back to the original question. As I understand, that this will save about $2 million, and every election cycle we hear about the troubles getting and recruiting judges to work elections. So was this about addressing those issues?
That's true. I would like to note that this is the same process the Board of Elections undertook after the last redistricting in 2012, after the City Council passed a new ward map after the 2010 U.S. Census. This time, the Board of Elections is already implementing redistricting ahead of petition circulation for the 2023 municipal election, which starts tomorrow, August 30th, because those elected officials are running for office within those new boundaries, including older people and the new CPD district council seats. So precincts needed to be redrawn within these new boundaries, as is ahead of the next November election. So many people's voting information and polling places were already changing ahead of November. They will be changing ahead of November with these new precincts. So as Ami mentioned, communication is key. And we appreciate you getting the word out and letting people know that they can go onto our website at chicagoelections.gov, go to your voter information and check if they're in a new ward, if they're in a new precinct, or if they've got a new polling place ahead of November. But as you did mention, the biggest issue that we continue to face ahead of every election is an election judge shortage. So the precinct consolidation, we previously needed about 11,000 election judges ahead of every election. Now we'll need about 6,500. And this is very important because nobody wants to see an empty judges table or a vacant precinct ahead of election day. So this precinct consolidation, we are hopeful, will help with those issues and lead to less delays in polling places opening on election day.
Yeah, Ami Gandhi, this has been a perennial issue here, recruiting enough folks, staffers to be election judges during every election cycle. Why do you think that is, and what are other ways to recruit more people to do this?
When there are young people out there and civic organizations out there who are eager to lend a hand in recruiting election judges, it's simply too early to say that we got to give up hope that we can't fill election judge shortages. There are inspiring organizations like Chicago Votes, Illinois Coalition for Immigrant and Refugee Rights, and others who partnered with Chicago Board of Elections and other election authorities during the 2020 elections to try to fill the gap. Young people in Chicago are eager to use their tech skills and their savvy and their ability to relate to, new people coming into the electorate in order to serve our voting process. And so it's really important to solidify those kind of partnerships as soon as possible, instead of assuming that we can't get enough people to participate, instead of assuming that we should slash resources for this sort of in-person voter access. Until we hear from more people who are directly affected by disenfranchisement, I would caution that it's too early to make some of those conclusions.
All right, Max Bever, we have 2, maybe 3 elections coming up in short order: November, the February municipal election, and if there's a runoff in April. Could a byproduct of this consolidation be longer lines at precincts? You mentioned same amount of polling places, but 790 fewer precincts. So could that mean longer lines?
We really hope that isn't the case. And we're looking at data to see that a lot of precinct polling locations, people and voting habits have changed. This last election, many precinct polling places saw only 100 voters all day long. So most polling places can handle then 200 or 300, although we would like to see turnout improve. Just this last election, over 50% of voters chose to early vote and to vote by mail. And this is where we must thank the Illinois legislature for continuing to expand voting access throughout the state and within Chicago and making vote by mail access more permanent. People can now join a permanent vote by mail roster and including increasing early voting options and now allowing early voting sites to stay open for election day as well. And that's an important thing in Chicago because we do have 51 early voting sites where anybody in Chicago can vote no matter where you live. Those are now open on election day so they can be a continued resource on election day for people who might not be able to make it home to their precinct polling place either before or after work. They can stop off in their lunch break to one of these sites and vote in any 50 wards of the city.
Plenty of ways to vote. We should mention that possibly 3 elections coming up. Those tend to be historically lower turnout elections, midterms, municipal elections. Ami Gandhi, still, if there are longer lines, are you worried about a disenfranchising effect that could have?
Illinois voters and Chicago voters have said time and time again that they want more options, more ways to be able to vote, not fewer ways. And so as we look toward not just the November elections, and it is reassuring to hear that there is the plan to keep the same number of polling places in place in November compared to June. What about future elections, though? There is a trend that, from a civil rights point of view, we find to be alarming to reduce the number of polling places, reduce the in-person election day footprint more generally is what we're hearing from election officials in Illinois and beyond. And voters are going to have something to say about that. If voters don't want to see their in-person access curtailed on election day, this is certainly the time to speak out.
All right, election season ramping up over the next few weeks and months, and our thanks to Max Bever and Ami Gandhi. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And now, Brandis, we toss it back to you.
Paris, thank you. Still to come on Chicago Tonight, leases for discount mall vendors have been extended. An update on some of the owners' plans for the Little Village shopping center. Racial segregation occurs in churches all over the country. We look at the impact in our Firsthand Segregation series. A year ago, thousands of Afghans came to the U.S. seeking refuge. Now, Muslim-led nonprofits work together to address new needs in the community. Plus, how a new exhibit at the Driehaus Museum is honoring the legacy of an architect, preservationist, and photographer. But first, some more of today's top stories. Illinois is suing Monsanto and its affiliates for producing polychlorinated biphenyls, known as PCBs, and then dumping the hazardous waste. Attorney General Kwame Raoul alleges the company knew the chemicals were toxic. In a lawsuit filed today, Raoul says Monsanto's reckless behavior at its plant in Sauget means groundwater is undrinkable in marginalized communities near East St. Louis. A Springfield man has been sentenced to 55 years in prison for the murder of a U.S. Marshal in 2019. Law enforcement were executing a warrant on Floyd Brown at a hotel in Rockford when Brown fired shots at them, including one that killed Deputy Jacob Keltner. Brown then led police on a high-speed chase until he was arrested just outside Springfield hours later. An NBA superstar from Chicago comes home. Former All-Star Tim Hardaway Sr. graduated from Carver Military Academy on the South Side in 1985. He returned today for a ceremony to retire his jersey.
But it's all about my teammates, my friends, who I grew up with, who taught me the game, who told me what was right, told me what was wrong, steered me in the right direction, made me go on a different path where I wanted to go this way. No, take your that way.
Hardaway played for 5 NBA teams, most notably the Golden State Warriors and Miami Heat. He was a 5-time NBA All-Star, and his son, Tim Hardaway Jr., is entering his 10th season in the league. Hardaway told students to listen to their teachers and parents. And now, Paris, we toss it back to you.
Thanks, Brandis. An update tonight on tenants at the discount mall in Little Village who are wondering if they'd be kicked out under a new owner. We're told vendors at the shopping center have been given an extension on their leases. The news comes after vendors spent a good part of the last 2 years wondering about their future at the mall, which was purchased by a company called Novak Construction in 2020. And Chicago Tonight's Joanna Hernandez joins us now with more. Joanna, you've been following this issue. You've talked to the tenants over the last year or so. It got bought by this company. They had no idea whether they're going to keep operating their stores or not, correct?
No, correct. And you know, since Novak Construction bought the building, vendors say that there hasn't been any clear plan on what the plans were for the property. So that's what was causing a lot of frustration. Now, I do have to mention that we know that Novak Construction owns the property, but there's two companies within the building that lease to those 150 vendors inside the mall. So we were told that the final contract for one side of the building was ending this month, which understandably so, many of the vendors say they were afraid to be displaced.
That's their livelihoods, and a lot of merchandise there they'd have to move in short order if that were the case. So what you're reporting today is the two companies that lease out all those spaces, they've been given a year extension.
No, that's true. So according to a Novak spokesperson, vendors have been given an extension on their leases until January of next year. And then there's going to be a month-to-month basis agreement going forward from there. Now, spokesperson goes on by saying, in part, we are planning to make substantial improvements to the neglected property, including a new facade, a new roof, better parking, and other improvements. These investments will make a big difference on that stretch of 26th Street. Novak expects the work to start next year. In Paris, I also spoke with Novak's representative over the phone, and she shut down any rumors of a big box retail company taking over that space, and she was adamant that at this point Novak is in negotiations with those two companies that lease to the vendors there.
I know that's a big concern in the community. Similar thing happened in Logan Square when their mega mall got torn down. So Joanna, you spoke with Alderman Byron Sigjo Lopez, 25th Ward, under the remap. This is going to be in his ward now. What did he have to say?
Now, correct. So the last time that I spoke with him, he said that his plan was to speak with the vendors. And earlier today, I got a chance to speak with him, and he says he has been speaking with the vendors. And according to him, Novak has agreed to meet with him in person. And he was very adamant that he wants to be part of this process. And also that he wants to include the vendors, especially since the Discount Mall is a huge staple to that community.
Yeah, and I know you've been after Novak, trying to get some comments from them for the last year. So good job today at getting this update. Joanna, thanks very much.
Thank you.
And up next, racial segregation in places of worship. So please stay with us.
We've made it.
Justice Jackson's appointment to the Supreme Court provides a beacon of hope.
Black women are underrepresented. We still rise. We still show up for one another.
It's us investing in the next generation and giving them something to enrich the next generation with.
One place where segregation has a particular stronghold today could be your local church. According to the Equal Justice Initiative, 86% of churches in the nation have no significant racial diversity. But what is the impact of worshiping separately? As part of WTTW's Firsthand Segregation Initiative, we dig into this topic deeper with Reverend John Edgerton, lead pastor at First United Church of Oak Park, and Pastor Nicholas Pierce, Chicago's Apostolic Church of God. Thanks to you both for joining us. Reverend Edgerton, let's start with you first. Why do you think segregation is still seen in our churches more than almost any other place in our society?
This is not a new phenomenon at all. This comes out of the soil of racism and white supremacy that has made this country what it is today, for worse. And we in the church are inheritors of a legacy in which the economic and political power of this country are concentrated in white hands, and that has been blessed by the church. Oftentimes the church has become a center of that concentration itself, and we are living out the history of this nation in our houses of worship.
Reverend Pierce, same question to you. Why do you think segregation is still seen in our churches?
Couldn't agree more. This is certainly fruit of the poisonous tree of racism. This is the bedrock of the American version of Christianity, And as we have seen over the centuries, not only has racism and racial inequality been tolerated by the church, it has in many cases been perpetuated and theologized about and sanctioned by the church. And now as we see the United States seemingly as divided as almost any time in its history, we find much of that white supremacist theology being held onto and propagated by many churches. Not all, but by enough for the national consciousness to conclude that this is what Christianity means.
And Reverend Pierce, to that point, how much are churches reflections of our communities?
Our churches are absolutely reflections of our communities because they are comprised of the very people who we live near and work with and shop with. And so in a very real sense, the church is a microcosm of the community. The fracturing that we see in the American church is a byproduct of the fracturing that we see in the broader American culture.
Reverend Edgerton, what would you say is the impact of segregation in churches on society as a whole?
To me, segregation's true harms come because economic and political power are held in too few hands, and that people are not able to thrive. Black people, other people of color are not able to thrive the way that they would in a more just society. Segregation cuts against God's dream for humanity, for the beloved kingdom of God that we are supposed to be living into. And it is not in service of the gospel for us to allow for our society as a whole to continue to be racially to be a system of racial hierarchy. And we need to break those barriers down.
Reverend Pierce, what could the impact, or how could society be impacted by more integrated churches?
I think, as Pastor Edgerton mentioned, the vision of God is of a beloved community in which barriers that divide us socially and culturally and otherwise are not overlooked, but are not viewed as barriers. I don't think the idea is for us to not notice white or black or brown, or to notice male or female. The idea is not to throw our uniqueness away. I believe God's vision is for us to be able to see each other and to appreciate the richness of how we have been created and how we have grown culturally, and to recognize that it does not have to divide us just because it distinguishes us. And if we can get that message, that we can have diversity without division, that we can have a degree of harmony without homogeneity, if we can get that right in the church, then I believe it'll have broad effects across the length and breadth of our country.
Reverend Edgerton, earlier this year, you and your church, quote, fasted from whiteness. It made some headlines, of course, but tell us a little bit about what your intention was there and how it worked.
Our intention there was to allow for our worship services in a predominantly white church to reflect the global majority of Christianity, which is not composed of white people. In the present day and through almost all of Christian history, Christianity has been a religion that has been centered in the global South. And for us, this was about being able to revel in the glory of what the Holy Spirit has done in the church so broadly. And so we found that our worship services were much enriched by taking part in the music and in the liturgy of the global majority of Christianity.
Reverend Pierce, what do you think can be done to diversify more church congregations?
Well, I think we have to recognize that diversity and inclusion, first, Brandis, are not the same. Diversifying congregations is one thing. Making them inclusive in a much more kingdom-oriented vision is a very different conversation. I see a lot of ministers and churches that claim to want to be multicultural, multiracial, multi-ethnic, but still be centered on a vision of whiteness that invites everyone else to surrender who they are and come to the table to be diverse. And that, I think, is problematic. I think if we're talking about being inclusive, part of it is embracing as we just heard from Pastor Egerton, this idea of saying, I'm not going to center my whiteness. I'm not going to center blackness. I'm not going to center my Latino or Asianness. I'm not going to center any of those social identities. I'm going to center Christ. And if we center around the gospel of Christ, around the cross of Jesus Christ, then we recognize that there's enough room for everyone, no matter what racial or cultural background they may come from. That is the difference. And so before we run to diversifying churches and trying to put black people in predominantly white churches and put white people in predominantly Latino churches, we have to recognize that there's some work around inclusion. There's some discipling that has to be done because, as we've noted, racism has been in the DNA of the church in America since its inception.
Okay, that's a good place to, not a good place to leave it, but that is where we'll have to leave it because obviously I'm sure you two gentlemen could talk about this a whole lot more. But thank you for joining us, Reverend John Edgerton and Reverend Nicholas Pierce.
Thanks, Brandis.
Thank you so much.
And you can learn more about the impact of segregation on other communities in Chicago by visiting WTTW.com/firsthand. And now to Paris for a look at how Muslim American nonprofits are organizing following the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan. Paris.
Brent, thanks very much. Yeah, a year after thousands of Afghan refugees settled in the U.S., Muslim-led nonprofits are working together to address common problems in their community. The Community Collaboration Initiative brings together 22 Muslim American nonprofits, most located in Chicago, in order to help each organization reach its mission faster. Organizations will share resources and networks to promote success among the Muslim community. And joining us to talk about this are Dilnas Warich, president of the Warich Family Fund, Dr. Saima Azvar, Director of Operations of the Midwest Region for ICNA Relief, and Amal Musin, Rehab and Welfare Committee Co-Chair for the Muslim Community Center. Welcome all of you to Chicago tonight. First, Dilnas Warich, this initiative is bringing together 22 Muslim nonprofits with the hopes that collaboration will help each individual nonprofit. Explain this program for us.
Sure. Thank you so much, Paris. So in 2017, our family did some research. We spoke to about 50 different Muslim-led nonprofits, and we found three things. Number one, we found Muslim-led nonprofits cooperate really well, but they have a different understanding of what collaboration means. So we really wanted to focus more on collaboration versus cooperation. The next thing we found out was in our survey that Muslim-led nonprofits definitely have great donors, but they may have a hard time stewarding their donors, making sure that their donors are engaged 365 days out of the year and really having a holistic approach to getting funding. And the third thing we found out is just the diversity in our Muslim-led nonprofits may not look like what Muslim America looks like. So those were the three findings we found. And through those findings, we created a 3-year research-based initiative called Community Collaboration Initiative, and we house it at Indiana University Lilly School of Philanthropy.
And Saima Azvar, first of all, explain the kinds of work your organization does and how this kind of collaboration will help your organization.
Assalamu alaikum and peace and hello everyone. Thank you for having me. So ICNA Relief is Islamic Circle of North America Relief. It's a national non-for-profit faith-based organization. And we have various programs from food pantries to health services to supporting refugees, back to school, and many more. And in Illinois, we have 2 main offices. One is in Glendale Heights, other one is in Westridge area. We have 2 satellite offices with the pantries. One is with Islamic Center of Naperville, and another one is in Southside with the Masjid al-Faruq. So we work, basically we work in partnership. So we have 100 local partners, and we serve everybody irrespective of race, religion, ethnicity. And with CCI, it has been a great experience learning about other organizations and what challenges they go through and how, it's similar. We learned that we are pretty similar.
Pretty similar. And the same question then to you, Amal Musin. Explain your organization for us and how this collaboration will help you out.
So MCC has 53 years of very diverse population that has walked through those doors. And we have 3 locations within the Chicagoland area, with Chicago being the main mother location, as well as the Morton Grove location and the Skokie location. So throughout the years, we have completed multiple projects throughout the community. We have a very strong educational background, as well as community services, funeral services, and other youth services. So multiple services are going through the doors of MCC all the time, every day, 7 days a week. Now, with this being said, one of our strongest arms is our Rehab and Welfare Committee, which does the charitable arm of the whole mosque. We essentially partner with any agencies which we have in the recent history, with the Muslim Women's Resource Center on Devon, allocating resources to the most recent arriving refugees with Afghanistan, as well as Syrian and Burmese refugees and other countries around the world. So we are definitely looking at services as a holistic look at it. And what we found in that last couple of years is that we cannot say no to any services that walk through those doors. So if anyone walks through the MCC door, and if they need help for any reason, we have to find help internally or externally.
There's a lot of folks that you need to help, and that leads me to my next question. Dilnaz Warich, how strained are organizations right now, given 1 year after the fall of Afghanistan and tens of thousands of refugees now coming to this country, including many in the Chicago area?
Thank you for asking that question, Paris. What we've realized is Muslim-led nonprofits are creating this stronger America. And as we're creating this stronger America, unfortunately, we're not getting the funding that we need to create these nonprofit services. So what we're making sure we do with Community Collaboration Initiative is we're trying to look for more funding. And we're realizing that philanthropy has a really uncomfortable feeling with faith-based initiatives. And what we're realizing is through a research that we did through a year of learning, we found 3 things. Number one, we found out philanthropy is uncomfortable working with faith-based initiatives. Number 2, we found out that philanthropy actually gives less funding to Muslim-led nonprofits versus their interfaith partners. So if you're a Muslim-led nonprofit, you will get funding from philanthropy and foundations, but you're just going to get less than maybe a different interfaith partner. And the last thing we found out through our research is that Muslim-led nonprofits are always rubbing against Islamophobia and having to prove how they are doing their quality of work. So that's what we found out through the Community Collaboration Initiative in 2021 through our research.
So maybe up against some hurdles here that other philanthropic organizations don't have. Saima Asfar, to you, since some 200 families have come from Afghanistan after the fall of Kabul, what have been the biggest needs, and can you meet all those needs?
So our approach is basically with refugees is 3-prong approach. One is basic essential, which is extremely needy at this point, even after 1 year. Second is mental health, and third is self-sufficiency. So right now, we really need basic essential items, which you can say food, household items, parts, pans, furniture, backpacks, school supplies, cleaning supplies, winter gear. Now winter is coming, hygiene items, diapers are extremely needy, clothes, shoes. So we are collecting these items. And then second thing is mental health, because they've been through so much. So this is one of the huge need, and you don't easily find clinical counselors who speak Pashto and Dari. So basically we started another program, which is called Mentor Program. We ask our community members to step up and become mentor, which is not equal to counseling, but we want them to, sign up, take the training, and basically start supporting these families. And third is self-sufficiency program. That's amazing. It's we basically teach them how to stand on their own feet. So cars is extremely important. Without cars, imagine Chicago's winter, you cannot survive. So last year we were able to provide 8 cars in Chicago to 8 families, but we are serving 200 families. So you can imagine the need.
So the need is, and it already was great, we should mention, but even greater now, given what's happened in Afghanistan over the last year. And we have to leave it there. Our thanks to Dilnaz Warich, Saima Azfar, and Amal Musin. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Paris.
And up next, honoring the legacy of an architect, preservationist, and photographer. But we take a look at the weather first. A Tale of Two Stories is taking center stage at the Richard H. Driehaus Museum as it explores the work of architect Louis Sullivan and a photographer on a literal life's mission to capture Sullivan's impact. Arts correspondent Angel Ito introduces us to Capturing Louis Sullivan, What Richard Nichols Saw.
We're moving both narratives forward throughout the whole exhibition, and it's sort of like an opera, I felt, because the music goes forward and then the drama. So we have two stories we're trying to tell.
It's a story of architect Louis Sullivan and photographer Richard Nichols, two artists connected through their work, but never in life. Born just 4 years after Sullivan's death, Richard Nichols committed his life's work to documenting Sullivan's architecture as both a photographer and preservationist. It was a decision he made when learning of Louis Sullivan's work while as a student at the IIT Institute of Design.
Richard Nichols was trying to record the buildings, one through taking photographs of them, and then second by salvaging architectural ornament, because the ornament was very important to Sullivan's idea of adding beauty and aesthetic dimension to his houses. So the exhibition is not only the photographs that Richard Nichols took, but also the artifacts that he salvaged.
Chicago buildings being created by Sullivan and his partner Dankmar Adler were being destroyed in the 1960s and 70s. A preservationist, Richard Nichols saw it his duty to document everything from behind the lens.
We're trying to tell a story about Richard Nichols' photography. For example, the auditorium photograph over there, Richard has climbed up high on the building across from the auditorium to get this magnificent view. He had no fear of heights. He was a paratrooper, I guess, during the Korean War, and he just jumped up top of buildings to get these great shots. He was a documentary photographer, and he told it as it was. So, warts and all, he showed the building in a documentary fashion, not to make them the most beautiful buildings, though of course the photographs are beautiful, but to really document, to show the buildings. And his goal was to publish a book, and he was gathering the photographs and of course the information, the documentation on the buildings. And he discovered buildings that were unknown by Adler and Sullivan, so he was doing research.
Nichols' research in the exhibition has been broken up into 4 themes, 2 on Sullivan's residential and commercial buildings, and the other 2 on the Chicago Stock Exchange building. That building is also the location of Richard Nichols' death. He died in 1972 while attempting to salvage pieces of the building when it collapsed on him. And while his commitment to preservation ended there, his life's mission lives on in more ways than one.
After Richard Nichols died, John Vinci created the Richard Nichols Committee, which had his archives, all of his negatives, all of the documentation. Maybe a decade later, they gave this to the Chicago Art Institute, and it's now in the Ryerson and Burnham Library at the Art Institute. So now there's a whole another generation who need to hear the story again about how Richard Nichols really gave his life to save buildings, and that was a mission that can inspire us for today.
For Chicago Tonight, I'm Angel Ito.
Two Icons, Capturing Louis Sullivan, What Richard Nichols Saw, runs through February 19th. And you can visit our website for more information on how you can watch the Chicago Story special, The Richard Nichols Story. And we're back to wrap things up right after this.
Chicago Tonight is made possible in part by Alexandra and John Nichols, the Jim and Kay Mabee family, the Polk Brothers Foundation, and the support of these donors.
And that's our show for this Monday night. Don't forget to stay connected with us by signing up for our daily briefing. And you can get Chicago Tonight streamed on Facebook, YouTube, and our website, WTTW.com/news. You can also get the show via podcast and the PBS video app. And please join us tomorrow night live at 7. A colossal collection of rare movie posters and lobby cards from a Chicagoan preserving screen history.
And a new school year, but are the problems the same? One-on-one with CTU President Stacey Davis Gates. But before that, join me tonight at 8 for our next Chicago Tonight Black Voices virtual community conversation. We'll talk about education equity as the new school year is underway. To RSVP, visit WTTW.com/events. And again, that's in just a few minutes at 8 p.m. Now, for all of us here at Chicago Tonight, I'm Brandis Friedman.
And I'm Paris Schutz. Thank you for watching. Stay healthy and safe, and have a great evening.